She snapped at me in front of her friends, said, "You can't even satisfy me, let alone provide for me." Everyone laughed. I didn't. I just smiled, finished my drink, and made a silent promise. The next time she sees me, she won't be laughing. I remember that night more vividly than I remember most things about her. It wasn't supposed to be an evening that changed my life. Just another Friday, another dimly lit bar in the middle of the city, where the noise is constant and the laughter feels rehearsed. I'd worked late, and she'd texted me around 8, saying, "Come by, we're just having a few drinks." There was no warmth in the message, no invitation between the words, but I went anyway. Back then, I still believed in fixing things that were already cracked. Before the story begins, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a twist. The place was one of those downtown lounges. Low lighting, crimson leather booths, walls sweating with neon reflections from outside. Her friends were already there when I arrived, half a circle of faces I'd seen too many times. Each one wearing that look of effortless amusement people wear when they think they'll never have to grow up. She was in the center of them, of course. Always the center. She looked radiant under the glow of the bar lights, hair tied back loosely, glass of champagne in her hand. When she saw me, she smiled, that quick, polite smile she reserved for people she'd already started to resent. I tried not to notice. I slid into the booth beside her, the seat cold under my palm, and the air thick with perfume and laughter. The conversation was already flowing. Stories about promotions, weekend trips, new restaurants, the usual city chatter about people pretending their lives were perfect. I laughed when they laughed. I nodded when I was supposed to. But every few minutes I caught her looking at me, her eyes distant, calculating. It was near midnight when it happened. One of her friends, a guy I'd never liked, made some joke about money, something about how you can't build a future without a real career. It was harmless, just drunken banter. But she turned to me then, and something shifted in her face. The music faded in my ears, the lights seemed to dim even lower, and in that space between one heartbeat and the next, she said it, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You can't even satisfy me, let alone provide for me." The words dropped like ice into warm water. There was a split second of silence, that uncomfortable pause before people decide how cruel they're allowed to be, and then laughter filled the booth. Her friends erupted. Someone even clapped. She smirked, eyes shining with a strange satisfaction, like she'd just won something invisible. I didn't say a word. I smiled, quietly, like the punchline had landed, and I was in on it too. Inside, something twisted. Not anger, not sadness. Something deeper. Something I didn't recognize yet. I finished my drink in one slow swallow, feeling the burn trail down my throat, and I made a silent promise. The next time she saw me, she wouldn't be laughing. That was the last time I saw her for almost 2 years. I walked out of that bar with the city lights swallowing me whole. The air outside was heavy with mist, the streets shimmering with the reflection of passing cars. I remember the sound of my shoes against the wet pavement, the hum of distant sirens, the faint pulse of music leaking from open doors. I didn't go home that night. I just walked, for hours, through alleys and empty squares, until the noise of the city became a kind of static in my head. When I finally reached my apartment, dawn was bleeding through the blinds. The place was silent, still smelling faintly of her perfume. She'd moved out 2 weeks earlier, boxes gone, drawers empty, her side of the bed cold and hollow. I sat on the floor beside the couch, staring at the city skyline outside my window. The words kept replaying in my head. "You can't even satisfy me," over and over, until they didn't sound like words anymore. Just noise. Days turned into weeks. I stopped going out, stopped answering calls. My job started to slip, though I didn't care much by then. I was still functioning, eating, working, pretending, but I was doing it all on autopilot. The city moved on around me, like it always does. People laughed, loved, broke apart, rebuilt, and I stayed still. Then something changed. It started small, a simple question I couldn't get rid of. What if she was right? That thought became the spark, and from that spark, something darker grew. I started running again, at first just to clear my head, but soon it became obsession. Every night, no matter the weather, I'd run through the city, across bridges, down empty streets, through parks that smelled of rain and asphalt. It wasn't about fitness or escape. It was about control. about proving to myself that I could outlast the voice in my head that kept whispering her words. Then came the gym, then the late nights studying things I'd ignored for years: finance, investments, self-discipline. I built routines like walls, woke at dawn, slept at midnight, every hour accounted for, every weakness targeted. I told myself it wasn't about her anymore, that I was rebuilding for me. But that was a lie. She was in every drop of sweat, every late-night note scribbled on paper, every quiet exhale before sunrise. The city changed with me. Or maybe I started seeing it differently. What once looked like chaos now looked like rhythm, predictable, mechanical, manageable. I noticed patterns in people, the way they spoke, the way they lied without realizing it. I started understanding power, not in money or status, but in silence. Months passed, then a year, and by then I was unrecognizable. I'd taken a promotion that came with a view of the skyline she used to love. I'd learned to move in rooms I used to feel small in. My voice was steadier, my clothes sharper, my smile quieter. But under all of it, the promise I'd made that night still hummed like a low, steady current. It was around that time that I saw her name again, not in person, but in a photograph someone had tagged online. A gallery opening downtown. She was there, smiling like nothing had ever gone wrong, surrounded by the same group from that night. But she looked older, not in years, exactly, but in something else, like the light around her had dimmed. The man beside her wasn't familiar. Suit, sharp jawline, that kind of arrogance you can smell before you see. They looked happy. For a moment, I felt that old ache rise in my chest. Then it passed. That was when the idea began. Not revenge, not yet. Something quieter. A seed of curiosity that would later become something else entirely. I started showing up at the same places she used to frequent. Never by coincidence. I knew where to look. The city has its circuits, and people like her rarely leave them. Wine bars, gallery openings, rooftop lounges, places built to be photographed in. I'd watch from a distance, always just out of sight, not hiding, but never close enough to be noticed. She laughed the same way she always had, but it didn't reach her eyes anymore. One night, after a long silence between us that had stretched into oblivion, she saw me. It was at a charity event downtown. I was there for work, or at least that's what I told myself. She was standing near the bar, a glass of red wine in hand, wearing that same effortless confidence that used to pull me in. When her eyes met mine, something flickered. Surprise, maybe, or guilt. She walked over slowly, smile cautious, like she wasn't sure if she had the right to approach me. "I didn't think I'd see you here," she said. "I didn't think I'd see you anywhere," I replied. There was a pause. The air between us felt charged, full of all the words we'd never said. She looked me over, my suit, the calm in my face. Her expression softened. "You look different," she said. "I suppose we all change." She hesitated, then smiled. "Maybe some of us for the better." I smiled back. But in that moment, something inside me shifted again. A strange calmness that wasn't forgiveness, but something colder. Because I realized then that she didn't remember that night the way I did. To her, it had been a fleeting moment of cruelty, lost in 1,000 others. To me, it had been the fracture that built the rest of my life. As she spoke, her new boyfriend joined her. He extended a hand, polite, firm. I shook it. He looked at her the way I used to, like she was everything. And for a brief second, I pitied him. Later that night, after the event ended and the city went quiet again, I stood on my balcony overlooking the streets and felt the weight of that silent promise return. Sharper now, almost tender in its clarity. She had humiliated me once, turned my silence into her victory. But this time, silence would belong to me. And that's where it all began. Not with anger, but with precision. Revenge wasn't about rage. It was about balance. The days after that charity event were the quietest I'd known in years. The city moved as if nothing had changed. Taxis cut through puddles of neon, the hum of construction filled the air like a low-grade pulse, and streetlights flickered on even as the sun disappeared behind the skyline. But for me, everything was different. I could feel it in the way the shadows stretched along the walls of my apartment, in the way the glass of wine I poured at night seemed to catch every reflection of my thoughts. She had unknowingly opened a door I'd been willing to step through all along, but now it wasn't just curiosity, it was necessity. I started documenting everything, not in a notebook, not on scraps of paper, but in meticulous digital files. Her routines, her favorite restaurants, the hours she usually visited the gallery, the streets she walked home from events, the friends she relied on to laugh for her. I didn't tell myself I was planning revenge yet. That word felt too raw, too emotional. I told myself I was collecting information, gathering threads to understand the pattern of her life. But every file I created, every photo I stored on a hidden drive, carried an undercurrent of intent. I began noticing the little things, the cracks she left in her polished exterior. Her phone never left her hand, yet she often hesitated before replying to messages from certain friends. She flinched slightly when someone brought up her childhood in conversation, and I remembered the way her laughter sometimes trembled. Quick, almost imperceptible. No one else seemed to notice, of course. People never see the flaws in what they admire. The city itself seemed to conspire with me. Alleyways became corridors of thought, rooftops became observatories, and the rain, God, the rain, it painted the streets with the kind of symmetry that only someone like me could appreciate. One night, standing on a fire escape overlooking an empty street, I realized I had begun to feel alive again. Not the distracted, drifting kind of life I had tolerated after that bar, but a sharp, precise awareness. Every detail mattered. Every moment could be used. Every weakness had weight. It was around that time that I started seeing her more frequently, though always from a distance. Not by coincidence. The city's circuits had taught me to recognize where she would appear, and I followed them quietly, invisibly. I would linger across the street from a gallery opening, watch her smile at someone who didn't deserve it, note the slight flicker of her gaze when she sensed something amiss. She never noticed me, and that was perfect. Then came the night I realized observation wasn't enough. The event had been a gala for some charitable foundation, high-profile faces, champagne and silver trays, the kind of night designed to be photographed for the city's social pages. I had slipped in unnoticed, moving like a shadow along the perimeter, camera in hand, not to record her image, but to understand her interactions. I watched as she moved through the crowd, polite, poised, entirely unaware that someone was analyzing every gesture, every word. And in that crowd I began to see the pieces that had always been missing. The subtle manipulations, the gentle lies that allowed her to appear flawless while everyone else bent around her. It wasn't cruelty I felt watching it, not yet, but fascination. There was a pattern to her, a rhythm, and it was beautiful in its own way. If I could understand that rhythm, control it, I could rewrite it. I started changing myself, quietly, not in a way anyone would notice immediately, but in subtle, precise ways. My diet became meticulous, my sleep regulated, my wardrobe sharp, my speech deliberate. Every interaction I had was a rehearsal. I practiced the tone of my voice, the inflections that made people listen, the pauses that made them question what I meant before I even spoke. My apartment became a workshop, not just for ideas, but for discipline, a laboratory of the self. It was during those nights of quiet transformation that I began to understand one immutable truth. Revenge wasn't about public humiliation. It wasn't about rage or yelling in someone's face. Real revenge was invisibility transformed into inevitability. It was the slow, precise rearrangement of circumstances until the person who had wronged you stumbled, not realizing the hand of fate was guided. And then, almost naturally, the first mistake came from her side. She trusted the wrong people, as people like her always do. Not overtly, not loudly, but in small ways. Leaving her phone on the counter, forgetting to lock her apartment door, allowing a friend to invite me casually to the same spaces she would appear. At first, these were coincidences, trivial in isolation, but coincidences, I learned, have a way of piling up until there's something else entirely. The first real contact, though still indirect, came from an email, a forwarding from one of her friends, nothing important on the surface. But inside, I found a glimpse of her world. Names, events, private plans. It was like watching her draw a map without realizing I was already standing at the edges, waiting. And standing there, I realized how much power the city gave someone who knew how to move through it like water. I could be anywhere. I could see everything. And she would never see me coming. I became patient. That was the hardest part. I had to wait for the right moment. The city is a living thing. It has its own timing, its own rhythm, and I could not rush it. Each day I spent immersed in observation, each night spent training my mind and body. brought me closer to the balance I sought. And yet I was always careful, not careless. One wrong step, one visible move, and everything I had built would crumble. During that period, I often walked alone through the city at night. Sometimes the rain fell, sometimes it didn't. I liked it best when it did. The reflections on the asphalt mirrored the life I wanted to construct. Clean, controlled, deliberate. The occasional passerby glanced at me, unaware of the calculations behind my gaze. And in those solitary walks, I allowed myself brief moments of thought, imagining the day I would cross paths with her again, imagining her face when she realized I was no longer the person she had mocked. But I tempered those thoughts with restraint. No theatrics, silence, subtlety, precision. I also began gathering intelligence about the man she now trusted, the one who had replaced me in her world. He was competent, yes, but predictable. People like him always are. He moved in patterns, relied on routines, underestimated the quiet ones, the observers. I took note. Every habit, every assumption, all of it would matter. And then came the first real test of patience. She had arranged a small gathering at a rooftop lounge. Her friends, some business associates, the new boyfriend. I was invited indirectly not by her, but by proximity. I was there under a different pretext, blending seamlessly into the background, unnoticed but observing. It was exhilarating. The old ache of humiliation surfaced briefly, sharp and bitter, but I suppressed it with a quiet satisfaction. I was no longer the man who sat in that bar 2 years ago, smiling while the world laughed at him. That man had ceased to exist. The night stretched like a slow film. Music, laughter, the clinking of glasses. She floated through it all like a queen, unaware of the forces quietly aligning around her. And for the first time, I saw clearly what had to happen. I didn't need to confront her. I didn't need words. I needed control. I needed to be the invisible hand that shifted everything she depended on until the foundation of her life trembled silently, invisibly. By the end of the night, I knew the next steps. Observation would continue, yes, but now action was necessary. Subtle, undetectable action. A misdelivered message here, a missed appointment there, the soft redirection of attention and energy until the very world she trusted began to rearrange itself without her realizing. And as I walked away from that rooftop, the wind biting at my jacket, the city sprawled below me in lights and shadow, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not triumph, not cruelty, just inevitability. The first threads had been pulled. The weave had begun. Everything from that point would move forward slowly, deliberately. The man I had once been, the one she had humiliated, was gone. In his place stood someone shaped by silence, patience, and quiet fury. And she, unknowingly, had handed me the tools to rewrite the story. For the first time in years, I slept without the ache of humiliation. I slept with the calm certainty that I was no longer at the mercy of her laughter. And the city, with all its noise and light and shadow, whispered in approval, as if recognizing the inevitability of what was to come. The city has a rhythm, a pulse that most people ignore. It hums quietly beneath the chaos. The lights, the sirens, the footsteps, the laughter, all a soundtrack for those who know how to listen. I learned to hear it. I moved through it like water, unnoticed, yet shaping everything around me. And now, more than ever, I understood what it meant to be patient. To wait. To let her life unfold while I quietly nudged it into the pattern I wanted. I began spending hours analyzing her social media posts, photographs, public appearances. Not obsessively, but methodically. Every detail mattered. The angle of a photo, the timing of a post, the people she surrounded herself with, each one a potential lever, a subtle point of influence. I traced her daily routes with maps, memorized schedules, and even began noting the little idiosyncrasies she left behind. The way she absent-mindedly tapped her ring against a glass when she was anxious, the soft exhale she made when someone complimented her work, the slight hesitation before replying to messages from certain friends. Her life was meticulously curated, but fragile. I realized that the very precision she relied on to maintain control was what made her vulnerable. People like her rarely expect interference from the shadows, from the invisible, deliberate presence that can twist a world without leaving fingerprints. I became that presence. I also began refining myself further, not just outwardly, though my wardrobe was sharper, my grooming meticulous, my body leaner, but inwardly. My mind became a machine, not in the cold mechanical sense, but in the focused, analytical way of a predator. I could sit for hours imagining scenarios, predicting reactions, testing consequences. Every thought was a rehearsal, every emotion was tempered. By the end of those months, I had become something unrecognizable even to myself, calm, precise, patient, and almost unnervingly detached. Then came the first real opportunity to test my subtle influence. One of her colleagues, someone she relied on for small but important favors, accidentally copied me into an email. The message was banal on the surface, a scheduling issue for a project she was coordinating, but it contained the tools I needed. I sent a careful, precise reply, not drawing attention to myself, but planting a seed, a question, a suggestion, a subtle nudge that would make her second-guess the reliability of her inner circle. It was fascinating. By the end of the week, tiny cracks had begun to form. A meeting was rescheduled without explanation. A minor miscommunication created tension between her and a friend she depended on. I didn't touch her directly, didn't make a sound, and yet the first ripple had appeared. The water had moved. Around this time, I began attending the same high-profile events she frequented: gallery openings, charity galas, industry mixers, always under the guise of business, always blending into the periphery. I never approached her directly. I didn't need to. My presence alone, carefully calculated, was enough to create subtle uncertainty. She noticed it eventually, of course, that faint recognition at the edge of a vision, the fleeting thought that someone was watching, but she dismissed it. People like her always dismiss the quiet ones. There were nights I spent alone, walking through the rain-slicked streets, watching neon reflections blur into puddles, imagining the day when every thread I had touched would snap in the right order. I knew the timing had to be perfect. Too early, and my plan would falter. Too late, and someone else might intervene, disrupting the fragile balance I was creating. Each step forward had to be measured, deliberate, invisible. And then she made another mistake, the kind of careless error that reveals more about a person than any confession ever could. She trusted the wrong friend, confided too much in someone whose loyalty was shallow, whose discretion was unreliable. I noticed it immediately. A simple slip, a private message intended for one person that ended up in the wrong inbox, and suddenly the first small threads of vulnerability became tangible, actionable. I began to manipulate these threads carefully, not overtly, not aggressively. Subtle shifts, suggestions left in the right hands, small misdirections that seemed accidental but were anything but. The tension began to mount, slowly, like the pressure building behind a dam. Her life continued as normal on the surface, but beneath, the foundation had begun to tremble. During this period, I also confronted my own emotions. The old ache, humiliation, resentment, the quiet fury that had simmered for years, surfaced again at night, in quiet moments alone. But I learned to channel it. Not into rage, but into clarity. I could almost feel the city itself acknowledging the transformation, the slow, deliberate choreography of a plan coming to life. And then, unexpectedly, she reached out. A message, casual, polite, almost innocent. "It's been a long time. Coffee?" I stared at the screen for a long moment. The temptation to respond impulsively was there, but I had learned restraint. This wasn't about reconnecting. This was about timing, about control. I replied, carefully neutral. "Sure. When?" We met a few days later in a quiet cafe, one of those places where the hum of conversation masks every small nuance. She looked the same, poised, polished, but there was a subtle tension I hadn't noticed before. Perhaps it was the way she shifted her weight in the chair, or the brief flicker of unease when she realized I had arrived early, sitting calmly at a corner table, eyes scanning, absorbing. The conversation was light, polite, a dance of social niceties. She spoke of work, of friends, of small city events I'd already noted in my files, but I didn't respond in kind. I listened, I observed, and beneath it all, I measured. Every pause, every smile, every hesitation became data. She had no idea that I had memorized her gestures, predicted her reactions, calculated the trajectory of this meeting long before we sat across from each other. When she laughed at something minor, a story about a friend, I felt a brief surge of satisfaction. Not the childish kind, not the rage-fueled kind, but the cold, precise acknowledgement that the invisible hand was moving as intended. I left the cafe before any opportunity for confrontation arose, allowing her to leave with the faint impression of normalcy intact. That night, Walking home through the empty streets, I realized the final layer of the plan was forming. It wasn't enough to manipulate her perception or the people around her. I had to orchestrate a scenario where she would confront the consequences of her past actions, where the humiliation she had inflicted on me would mirror back, perfectly balanced, like a shadow landing in the right place. And yet, even as I formulated the final steps, there was a part of me that hesitated. Not because of doubt. I was confident, meticulous, but because of the weight of inevitability. I had transformed into something that was neither the man I had been nor the man she had known. In my pursuit of balance, I had become a figure of quiet inevitability, a shadow moving in sync with the city itself. And shadows, by their nature, are patient. The first significant move came weeks later. A small miscommunication at work, subtly encouraged by a mutual acquaintance I had guided, created a ripple effect that reached her directly. She began to doubt, to second-guess, to wonder why things she had always controlled seemed to slip through her fingers. I didn't intervene. I simply observed. The city hummed around us, indifferent, and I felt that low, steady current of satisfaction, the quiet thrill of a plan executed with precision. And through it all, I never revealed myself. I never acted with rage, never confronted her openly. Every action was silent, invisible, deliberate. The tension grew in the background, a pressure she could feel but could never identify. The pieces were moving themselves into place, and when the moment arrived, the final act, she would find herself alone in the consequences, unaware that a shadow she had long forgotten had orchestrated everything. The night she finally noticed me, it wasn't in a bar or a gallery or any place I had carefully predicted. It was at an abandoned stretch of the waterfront, a quiet part of the city most people avoided, where the only sounds were the lapping water against rusted pilings and the occasional distant hum of a cargo ship. I had orchestrated this indirectly, of course, a chance encounter, or what she would perceive as one. I watched her from a shadowed stairwell leading down to the docks. She was alone, phone in hand, walking briskly, unaware of the slow inevitability approaching. The city around her had gone silent, the way it does just before a storm, and in that hush I felt the pulse of the moment, delicate, fragile, yet unmistakable. This was the culmination of everything. Observation, patience, subtle manipulation, quiet control. Every step she had taken in her life since that night in the bar had led here. When she glanced up, just slightly, I allowed my presence to register, not threateningly, but undeniably. She froze for a heartbeat, as though the air itself had shifted. Recognition flickered across her face, but it was tangled with confusion. "You," she said softly, her voice trembling. Not with fear, not yet, but with a tension I could almost taste. "Yes," I replied. My voice was calm, measured, steady, every syllable deliberate. I didn't step forward. I didn't raise my hands. I didn't need to. The silence between us was sharper than any weapon. She tried to smile, a reflex, but it faltered. I didn't expect. I shook my head slightly. You don't get to expect anything anymore. Not from me. Her gaze flicked around, suddenly aware that this was no ordinary meeting. She noticed the emptiness of the waterfront, the shadows stretching long and thin, the absence of anyone else. And then for the first time the fear arrived, subtle, creeping, almost imperceptible. You've been following me." Her voice was steadier now, a mix of accusation and disbelief. "I've been watching, yes," I admitted. Not defensively, not proudly, just stating a fact. Not out of anger, not out of malice, out of necessity. To ensure balance. Her eyebrows furrowed. Balance? I took a slow step toward her, careful to keep my distance. "Do you remember that night?" The bar, the memory hit her instantly. I could see it in the slight narrowing of her eyes, the quick intake of breath, the flash of guilt she tried to hide behind irritation. You're insane," she whispered, almost to herself. "No," I said. "I'm patient. I'm precise. And now you'll see consequences." I didn't strike, didn't yell, didn't confront her with accusations. I didn't need to. The plan I had spent years perfecting had reached its tipping point. The friends she trusted, the events she relied on, the subtle manipulations I had set in motion, they had converged into a situation she could not control. I watched the realization dawn in her eyes, the faint panic as the invisible threads I had pulled tightened around her life. She stumbled slightly back, clutching her phone. "Why are you doing this?" I smiled, not warmly, not cruelly, just with quiet inevitability. Because you laughed at me. Because you thought my silence was weakness. Because I promised myself that the next time you saw me, you wouldn't be laughing. Her breathing quickened. She looked toward the water, toward the empty streets, toward the city skyline that had once seemed so bright and forgiving. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had always moved through the city like it belonged to her, believing her beauty, her charm, her social grace insulated her from consequences. But the city, like me, had learned her rhythm, and now she was trapped within it. The first of the subtle consequences manifested immediately. Notifications flashed on her phone, messages revealing betrayals, small failures, whispers she hadn't anticipated. Friends she had trusted began canceling appointments, business opportunities fell apart, and tiny public embarrassments multiplied silently, inexorably, each one a thread in the net I had woven around her. She gasped as she realized the orchestration, the precision, the impossibility of it. How? She stammered, panic growing in her voice. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I let the city speak for me. The streets, the lights, the distant hum of life, all conspiring to show her the consequences she had never imagined. And as she looked at me again, truly looking, she saw not a man, not a victim, not a shadow, but inevitability itself. And then, just when she thought she had nowhere to turn, the final, shocking layer unfolded. The man she trusted most, the one she thought would protect her, guide her, stand by her side, faltered spectacularly. Every subtle manipulation I had placed earlier now culminated in his failure. Missed deadlines, miscommunications, exposed weaknesses, her foundation crumbled around her, not with dramatic violence, but quietly, tragically, unmistakably. I approached one step closer, maintaining calm, precision, and control. Do you understand now? Tears glistened in her eyes, frustration mingled with helplessness. I didn't. You underestimated me, I said softly. You thought silence was weakness. You thought time would erase it. But I've been here all along. Her lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. The truth had settled, heavy and undeniable, and it was worse than anything I could have said. She had been laughing at a ghost, a man who no longer existed, and now that ghost had become the architect of her unraveling. The city stretched out behind us, indifferent, glowing, alive. I let her stand there, frozen, as the final pieces of my plan fell into place. Not with spectacle, not with screams or fury, but with the quiet, almost serene inevitability that had defined every step of my journey. And then, just as I turned to leave, she whispered one word, trembling and raw. Why? I paused, not to answer, but to let the weight of everything settle, because the answer, unspoken, was all around her, years of patience, observation, and silent calculation. Every small humiliation she had inflicted, every careless moment she had assumed invisible, had been returned, not with rage, but with precision. I walked away into the mist of the city, leaving her behind on the waterfront, surrounded by shadows and consequences. The silence of the night enveloped me, and I felt the strange, hollow satisfaction of inevitability fulfilled. But even as I disappeared into the streets, a faint echo lingered in my chest, a sense of loss I hadn't anticipated. Because revenge, no matter how carefully executed, leaves a scar on the avenger as well. The city reclaimed its pulse, lights flickering in reflection, sirens distant, footsteps echoing somewhere far away. And I realized for the first time that in taking back my power, in delivering consequences, I had lost something irretrievable. The man she had mocked, the man who had smiled through humiliation, had been replaced not just by precision, but by something emptier, colder, a shadow walking through a city that would never notice him again. I disappeared into the night, the waterfront fading behind me, and she remained there, trapped in a moment she could not control, surrounded by the consequences she could not undo, facing a truth more painful than any mockery, that the ghost she had ignored was no longer silent. And the city whispered in agreement, indifferent but approving. As I walked away, a man remained in patience, precision, and quiet, tragic inevitability. The city had begun to feel different to me, not brighter, not more alive, but heavier, as if every street, every shadow, every faint flicker of neon carried the weight of what had happened. The revenge had been delivered. Every subtle nudge, every careful manipulation, every invisible thread I had woven into her life had culminated in a quiet collapse, the consequences falling around her like rain on glass, precise and inevitable. but the satisfaction I had imagined never fully arrived. Instead, there was an emptiness I hadn't anticipated, a quiet hollow where triumph should have been, a space where my reflection in the darkened windows of the city stared back at me with a kind of unrecognizable neutrality. The man she had laughed at, the man she had thought weak, had been replaced by someone meticulous, deliberate, capable, and yet incapable of feeling the warmth of satisfaction that revenge promised. Days passed. The city's pulse continued around me, indifferent, glowing, relentless. People moved through the streets, oblivious to the shadow that had slipped past their attention. The skyline at dusk, usually a comfort, now seemed like a barrier I could never cross, a reminder of a life I had left behind, of a version of myself I had sacrificed for precision and control. And then the revelation came. Not through her, not through any friend, not through the network of subtle manipulations I had constructed, but through him, the man she had trusted, the one I had carefully observed and subtly undermined, reached out unexpectedly. Not with confrontation, not with anger, but with information. A simple message on an encrypted channel. She isn't who you think she is. There's more. You need to know. I remember staring at the screen for hours, staring until the city outside blurred, until the hum of traffic and the distant sirens became meaningless. A deep, cold unease settled over me. More than 2 years of calculation, patience, observation, and now the foundation of everything was about to shift beneath me. I began digging, carefully, meticulously, as I always did. Public records, private contacts, subtle interviews with people I had already met, small inquiries disguised as coincidence. And the truth emerged slowly, like fog rolling over the river at dawn. She wasn't just careless. She wasn't just cruel or naive. She had been hiding something, a part of her life so intertwined with the city, with its networks and shadows, that even I had failed to notice. Someone else had been orchestrating her actions, shaping her world in ways that mirrored my own methods. She wasn't entirely innocent, and I wasn't entirely right to assume she was. And then the real revelation hit. I had been manipulated as well, not in the grand theatrical sense. No one had tricked me into revealing my plans or my emotions, but every subtle movement I had made, every careful manipulation I had enacted, had been anticipated. She had learned, without me noticing, to use my patterns against her own vulnerabilities. The irony was bitter. The silent revenge I had constructed, the precise collapse I had orchestrated, had only highlighted her adaptability. I realized in that moment that the city had been her ally all along, not mine. Every shadow, every street, every moment of isolation I had used to plan had been something she understood just as well, maybe even better. I found her one night, months after the waterfront encounter. Not to confront her, not to claim triumph, but because I needed to see the consequences of my own obsession reflected in her eyes. She was in the same cafe where we had first met, sitting alone, staring at a glass of wine, as though it contained the answers she sought. When she saw me, she didn't flinch. She didn't panic. She simply acknowledged me, a faint smile playing at the edge of her lips. And in that smile, I saw something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not because she had won, not because she had outmaneuvered me entirely, but because, somehow, the world had righted itself in her perception. I sat across from her in silence. Neither of us spoke at first. The hum of the cafe, the clinking of cups, the distant hiss of the espresso machine, it all felt amplified, like the city itself was holding its breath. "You survived it," she said finally. "I did," I replied, and I could not deny it. But survival was not victory. Survival had come at a cost I hadn't fully calculated. She nodded slowly. "And yet, we are still here." Yes, we were still here. Both of us, different versions of who we had been, haunted by the same city, bound by the same silent obsessions. The world had not ended, but neither of us had found the resolution we imagined. Revenge had a cost, not only to the one it fell upon, but to the one who delivered it. The tragic truth became clear in the following weeks. The man I had become, the shadow walking through the city with quiet inevitability, was no longer capable of feeling joy, intimacy, or trust. I had traded every ounce of vulnerability, every moment of human softness, for precision, for calculation, for revenge. And yet, even as I moved through the streets, unnoticed and unremarkable, I felt her presence lingering. Not as fear, not as humiliation, but as a reminder of what had driven me to this. She, too, had changed. The carefully curated exterior, the charm and polish, had been stripped layer by layer by the events I had set into motion. But the inner core, the adaptability, the quiet cunning I had overlooked remained intact. She had survived, perhaps even grown, while I had sacrificed something irretrievable. It was then I understood the ultimate revelation. Revenge is never absolute. Control is never complete. The consequences we impose on others always return in some form, refracted through the lives we touch, the mistakes we overlook, the vulnerabilities we fail to notice. I walked the streets alone, the city lights reflecting in puddles from the rain earlier that night, and I felt the weight of inevitability once more. Not her laughter anymore, that had faded, replaced by silence, but the quiet recognition of what had been lost. I had achieved precision, control, invisibility, but at the cost of my own humanity. And that, more than her mockery, more than the years of planning, more than the meticulous collapse I had orchestrated, was the true cost of revenge. I stood on the same bridge where I had first trained myself to move silently, to observe, to wait. The skyline stretched out in front of me, glittering and indifferent. And I asked myself questions I had avoided for too long. Had I become what I hated? Was the man I had rebuilt myself into worth the hollow ache it left behind? Was revenge ever truly satisfying, or was it simply a mirror reflecting the emptiness we carry inside? Could I ever rebuild the life I had sacrificed in the pursuit of vindication, or was that part of me forever lost to the shadows I had embraced? As the wind swept across the bridge, carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt, I realized there were no easy answers. Only reflections, only the echoes of choices, only the consequences we can see and the ones we cannot. And perhaps that was the final revelation. In the pursuit of vengeance, we often forget that the true reckoning is not with the person we punish, but with ourselves. When we pursue revenge, what do we truly gain? Control, satisfaction, or just the illusion of justice? Can someone ever fully reclaim themselves after sacrificing parts of their humanity in pursuit of retribution? And in the end, when the dust settles and the consequences ripple quietly through lives, how do we measure victory? By the downfall of another, or by what remains of ourselves? Are we shaping fate, or merely walking the paths it has already laid before us?